Are you biased? You might say no, but it turns out that this is actually a bias. According to this show's guest, Nassim Abdi, everybody is biased. But it also turns out there are a couple of things that we can do about it. Biases tend to get in our way. They tend to get in our way when it comes to inclusion. They tend to get in our way when it comes to including ourselves, because sometimes actually our biases lead us to behave in a way that excludes us. If you want to learn about that, if you want to learn how biases impact your behavior and what biases you have, this is your session. Hi, I'm Ingo Rao, and I'm the host at the School of Becoming. This session is brought to you in collaboration with Manage Magazine, as well as a fantastic group of individuals that have supported me in curating this program. Our program on active inclusion tries to support you in understanding inclusion on an individual, interpersonal, leadership, organizational, and cultural level. This is the first session in the series, and Nassim is going to help us understand our biases and what we can do about them. Nassim has a PhD in adult learning. She has also a career as an actress and was featured in a movie that I forgot the name about, but maybe Nassim, you can tell us about that in a minute. That maybe explains why her passion is the combination of entertainment and learning, which is also reflected in the startup that she co-founded called StoryBolt. StoryBolt is an organization that specializes in helping large organizations to have difficult conversations around gender, equality, diversity, race, and other topics that are usually not that easy to discuss in a corporate setting. The uniqueness about this firm is that they use documentaries as a trigger that helps us to break the ice and start to think and engage in a conversation about these important topics, which is part of what you're going to experience in this session. With that, welcome, Nassim.
Thank you so much, Ingo. Thanks for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. And hello, everyone from all around the world. That's amazing. I'm looking at the chat and where people are coming from. This is amazing. To answer your question, the film is called Secret Ballot, which is pretty relevant to these days conversations in the US about elections. But I just happened to be the leading actress of that film, which was an amazing experience, but it was successful because of the brilliant director. But thank you so much for mentioning that. It gave me the experience of understanding and seeing the impact of film and storytelling. For sure, that was the connection with what I'm doing these days, StoryBolt, and what I'm passionate about. And I love all these sessions that you've lined up, so I can't wait to learn from speakers who are coming from today on, and I'm passionate to share them with our also audience. With that, I think we can just start talking about the topic that we are here for today, which is we are all biased, now what? And just conversation around implicit bias. If that's okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen so we can see what we have. As Ingo said, what I do these days is a StoryBolt, which is we are unpacking biases one story at a time. And I'll share more with you about that and how that happens. But what I would like to start from, especially now that I know everyone comes from different corners of the world, it's even more exciting. I would like to talk with you about implicit bias by starting with a puzzle. So let's start here. So here is a question, or it's a riddle that I'm going to read to you. A group of STEM professors assess identical resumes. Half of the professors perceive the candidate as less competent. They offer that candidate a lower salary, and they believe is deemed to be more likely to mishandle a nerve agent and cause the death of thousands. The other half perceive the candidate as a very competent person with great skills to handle any situation successfully and offered a higher salary. How is that possible? Please share your answers in the chat box and let us know what you think about this. So what is the situation here? How is that possible with identical resumes? So I'll give it like 1 minute or less. And I guess we already started seeing.
John commented already, some form of bias? Yes, probably, right? Given the
Probably.
topic today.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what people guess in terms of what type of bias.
Yeah.
So there is Frankie says like bias in terms of name, age, etc. Then Deepayan from India says that like some kind of group bias, maybe like in terms of like I guess the group of evaluating people versus like the applicants. Shannon says affinity bias, so how close individuals are. Danica says the ones who could relate to the candidates wanted to offer a higher salary. So obviously there's something about relationship here related to bias.
Mm-hmm.
Then Samia offers each professor sees the resume through their own eyes, perspectives, experiences, and stereotypes.
Right.
And my Lynn says maybe nepotism of some sorts as well, knowing the hiring panel. Yes.
Love these answers. And Dorothy says gender bias right there, up there. So amazing, amazing answers. And let's jump into the answer, which is very close to what all of you are saying here. And it's based on a study, actually. This is not something that I made up of myself. This is based on a study that has been done in several different formats. One was in form of resumes, which they had the similar resume, but they called the applicant Jennifer for one group of reviewers and called the applicant John for another group of reviewers. And they gave these resumes to this group of faculty members to decide about the candidate. And that was the result that they got, which was very interesting to see that it's just the name and the gender of the applicant created all these differences. This study has been done on musicians as well and several other groups, and they got the same result, interestingly, on gender. And it's been done on other categories as well, besides gender, sexuality, class, nationality, ethnicity, language. And it's amazing and pretty disappointing when we see that, right? After we hear about the result. But let's jump into why this happens and what is it. Something that is very interesting about this kind of decision making or this kind of approach is it's not something that people are aware of. That's why it's called implicit bias or unconscious bias or implicit social cognition. It's technically what happens there is we make our decisions based on prejudice or stereotypes that our brain has without intention. That's why it's called implicit bias. It's not explicit. We all think that this is something that we obviously are not biased about. Of course, I'm going to rate Jennifer the same as John. But unfortunately, this is not the reality when it comes to real world. Another example is, for example, imagine Frank. He's explicitly mentioning that he believes men and women are equally capable of working outside of the house, but when he's in the office, the decisions that he makes, some sort of priority he gives to men, to women, when he wants to promote one of the team members or when he wants to hire a new person and all that. So he doesn't believe that he has any biases between men and women, but that's what happens when it comes to decision making. So that's why unconscious bias is something that impacts, as you all I'm sure know, impacts our criminal justice system, health system, school setting, workplaces, and everywhere. Even our friendships are impacted by that. So with that, I want to invite everyone here, all of us, to watch a brief clip to learn a little more about this concept, which is impacting every part of our lives. So I love this analogy of peanut butter and jelly. It's a very simple, plain analogy, and it sort of shows us how we associate things to each other. And it's not something that we decide about. It's our brain for millions of years has been trained to categorize things to protect us. And when we receive this category, as the video explained, it's like a fog around us that we breathe in every day. We don't really know what are the biases that we have, because these are the categories that are in our brain, either because of what we've observed or what happened to us. I don't know if you've, Ingo, have you, when you're watching this, were you thinking about any biases that you might have, or?
Oh yeah, sure. Like I think I had plenty, and I still have plenty. I think, as the video explained, it's part of our makeup. It's part of the culture that we grew up in. I grew up in Germany, predominant white in the area that I grew up, and of course, I still remember like going to like I think third grade, and for the first time in my life, seeing a Black person. Now, if you never saw like a person from another race before, it's kind of like this thing where everybody looks the same. And you kind of started kind of making an assumption that like, I couldn't distinguish them. And so I think the same thing holds true the other way around. A friend of mine did work in Central Africa, and people there perceived him, because he was white, as the same person as the bishop that was, or the priest that was leading the parish. So of course, like we assume that the impression we get of somebody else is the impression that we extend that to everybody else. And I had many of those, not necessarily tied to race, but also tied to different musical genres, tied to tattoos, tied to people living on the street, tied to like even like in the classroom, students. Like if I have a large group of students, and for those of you who are teachers, you might have the same. It's like, okay, this person is probably like this person is probably like this, and this is highly unfair, and I recognize that. No, these are all great moments that you mentioned, especially classroom. As a teacher, I had to really think about my biases before I start tagging people with different titles in my brain. I do have a specific story that I want to share, and I want to be vulnerable here and share it. I don't share it everywhere, but I think this is a very relevant conversation that we are having today. I just want to start with that I know I'm biased, and I'm going to tell you the story behind it. One that I know, and as just you mentioned, Ingo, and many others probably feel the same way. There are so many different biases that we all have, but this one is specific, happened to me after a specific situation in 2017. Unfortunately, so I'm an immigrant, as you can obviously say from my English accent. I'm an immigrant from Iran, living in the US in Chicago area. And I saw someone from Chicago in the chat box, so hi from there. And I was in a very progressive work environment in 2017. And all of a sudden, I was shocked with hate letter, a handwritten hate letter in my notebook, which was a really sad thing that happened to me. And unfortunately, I almost knew the person, and I knew she was a white female that was in a cohort with me. And so the whole story was really sad. And even right now, when I'm talking about it, I have to stop and pause and take a deep breath to continue. But what happened after that to me was something very interesting. I noticed that I started associating white female around me to what happened to me with that hate letter. And the hate letter was about going back, go home, immigrant, something like that, along those lines. And I started noticing myself categorizing many of people around me with that category of like white female into people that I have to defend myself in front of. And I have to react in a way that's why I am here, what I am doing here, and explaining myself.
and not trusting them as much as I did before, which was a really sad thing. And I even started stuttering in front of them. I couldn't speak comfortably, which showed me that it's very extreme. This is really something that I need to do something about. And I jumped deep into it, and I started really thinking about how can I change that, which we are going to talk about today in this conversation as well. And first of all, I started recognizing it, which was the most important part. And then I started making new friends. I had so many amazing white female friends, and I started sharing this story with them and telling them how much it hurts when I have these feelings. And we started really meaningful conversations around this, which helped me a lot. Would love to hear if you have any other thoughts on that, if you are recognizing in your own stories or behaviors any kind of implicit biases that now you're noticing while we are going through this. But one thing that we want to make sure to mention here is implicit bias, as just a video clip also mentioned, does not equal to discrimination. Thank you, Danica. And most important part is to be aware of these biases so we can overcome them when we are in a situation. They are huge challenges. They are not an easy thing to deal with, these biases, especially because we don't know that they exist. But the good news here is, if we do have right interventions and if we try hard to recognize them and understand them, there is hope, and it's possible to decrease them. And that's based on studies being done in the US with interventions on implicit bias. So that's the good news. That makes me happy that we can make progress with that. And here are some tips and tricks that has been shared in different studies, and I personally use them in my own life, and I got result. And I hope to see the same thing for everyone here and whoever who thinks about implicit bias. The first and most important thing is being aware of them. That as human beings, we are all biased, and these are cognitive biases that we have. And we can't do anything about them if we don't recognize them, if we don't mention them or accept them. Another thing that is very important is these biases are mostly made because of the categories that we observe or we've been fit into through media or situations that happen to us. So it is really important when we face these biases, take them out of our brain, look at them in face, and think about, are they based on facts or our guts? If I'm facing the next white female, are there facts around that every white female is going to give me a hate letter? Or this is just because of the situation that happened to me, and now I have this feeling of getting into that situation. So that was one of a very important one to me that helped me. Always thinking about facts versus guts. Another one which is part of that is pausing and reflecting before making any decision, before making a decision about promoting the next employee in your team, hiring the next person, making friendships, and just having conversations with people. Pausing about what are my biases and reflecting on those and being intentional is really helpful. And another thing is based on research structures and systems, which are, I would call them double-edged knives. They can be structures and systems could create discrimination, yes, but also if we are intentional and we are aware of how they can help, we can create structures and systems that avoid biases and implicit biases and discrimination. Another thing is starting conversations with people around us, so to get to know them, the same thing I did with my white female friends. And one that is very important to me, and I know I'm biased about it because that's what I do every day, but studies also showed the impact of our listening and watching and exposing ourselves to diverse stories. And I see a lot of chat here.
Yeah, Nassim, we had just like a couple of people that resonated with your story, and we had Frankie here sharing a little bit about his story. And he writes that he has faced a similar experience in the past as a queer, non-binary person. I have felt a lot of homophobia from straight men. I found them as a threat, so would avoid spending time with them due to the past experiences. I have recently met one of my best friends who is a straight, sweet, kind, loving man who cares about my identity and is an ally to equality. And Fasella writes that the story, probably referring to Frankie as well as yours, are very powerful, and that she had similar experience that came flooding back to her as you like we're talking about this, and as she read, I think the text here in the box. And I think Frankie, I don't know if you want to comment on your story and the tips and tricks that you just heard in terms of like how do you think we can engage in that. So if you want to share, I just want to invite you. But I also want to say thank you for sharing this, because as Nassim just explained, like sharing your story and exposing this is a way for others to feel like involved in the conversation and opens up channels for others to have a conversation. So thank you very much for doing so.
Yeah, I got goosebumps, honestly, Ingo. Thank you so much, Frankie and Fazela, for sharing your stories and for mentioning that. That's exactly actually what I want to focus on in my the rest of the time that we have, how much these conversations and listening to each other's stories are important. Stories are the catalysts. They are making it easier and possible for us to start conversations. And here is how. So there are three important pillars for any meaningful conversation. To have a meaningful conversation, we need to have empathy, right? We need to be aware and have the empathy around a topic. Just like the story that Frankie shared, if someone is aware about LGBTQ and the kind of rights or conditions, situations that they have, or aware of immigrants and the kind of rights and situations that they have, and have that empathy and awareness around it, that's the first step for having a conversation. Then curiosity and being curious enough to ask good questions around that topic. There are things that we don't know about the topic, but we need to have that curiosity and interest to ask those questions. And then connection, how it's connected to my life, right? To my everyday life. And when we have all these three, that's when we can start a meaningful conversation around any topic. And the beauty of stories and storytelling is it checks all these three boxes. When we have a compelling story that is a character-driven story, and it's emotional, it checks the box of empathy, curiosity, and connection. That's when we can have a really meaningful conversation. And if the story is in visual format, a documentary, a film, it's even more powerful because different parts of our brain start working at the same time. So our sound, visuals, language comprehension all start working at the same time. And there is little chance that we forget that story. And it helps a lot with starting a conversation around the topic. And I see more chats coming up, Ingo, so please share if there are things that are relevant. I would love to hear.
Yes, I think right now they're very complementary to what you're saying. Fasella said that feeling hurt also made me become more aware of how I treat people.
Right.
in response to the tactics. And I think it's another way that this discrepancy shows up between how I think I'm right and behave versus what the reality is, which I think you also underlined in what you said about story. And we have Priyanka, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who was reminded of the 5 elements of a story. A character, a setting, a plot, a problem, and a solution. So it's really about this story arc and this experience that we go through, like in a story, that we don't have to go through ourselves, but we can immerse ourselves in the story of somebody else. And I guess that's where we're going next.
Yeah, that's where we're going next. Exactly. I want to share a beautiful story of someone that I'm not going to tell you a lot about it, just want you to watch it. But we wanna just jump into this experience of watching a story of someone, and then we'll have conversation about it. So without further ado, let me just play this video.
What do I like about flying? I guess it is being a bird, to be able as a person, as a human being, to lift off from the earth. I can't tell you what a pleasing thing is to be taking off from an airport and you're in the clouds and you're flying up, and there's sort of all of a sudden there's a glow in front of you, and as you go further and further and you break out, you see the clouds look like just wonderful balls of cotton all lit up by the moon. It's extraordinary. My name is Robina Asti. I'm 92 and I live in New York all my life. I am a commercial pilot and I'm a flight instructor. Because of that, the Navy wanted me to join them. So I worked my way up in rank, and then I became 21 in 1942. Of course, the war had started by then, and in the Pacific, I flew airplanes. It was quite an adventure. I must say that it was a startling, delightful time in my life. One of the unique things about flying is that you've got to be able to move from one position to another, because you can, and not accept where you are. In 1976, I finally decided that I must become a woman. What was so amazing about it, once I made the change, I became a woman in body and soul and mind. It ended up being a rebirth. The prejudice against me changing was extraordinary. I was a vice president of a pretty big mutual fund at that time. I was going to work as a man and changing to a woman. In the evening, it became quite burdensome, and I knew that it would never be acceptable then. And finally, one day, I said, that's it. And I quit and decided I had to live and work as a woman. So I went out as a woman in the world, and I changed my sex in aviation. Now, as far as the FAA is concerned, they only know me as a woman. I changed my Social Security, I changed my driver's license, and I even got a passport for the United States as a woman. Norwood Samuel Patton. He was born on August 15th, 1915. After I changed, we met at a bar, and then we met again for a little date, and it ended up that we became very, very close. When I saw that, look, this has to be serious, I knew that I had to then tell Norwood. So I told him, and he was very upset. But inside of a week, he came back to me and said, told me, look, I don't care. You're a woman. I only know you as a woman. You are a beautiful woman, and I love you, and I'm very devoted to you, and I want always to be with you. And that was the summation of it. We got married at an airport. Every month, he would ask me to marry him. Formally asked me to get married. And I kept putting it off. Finally, in 2004, I told Norwood, yes, let's get married. It was a delightful relationship. It was, without a doubt, the finest time of my life. He was 97 when he died, so we're a couple of old fogies. I was looking for Social Security aid. Nothing happened that wasn't routine in the beginning. However, at the very end of it, when I thought, well, now all we got to do is sign some papers and that's it, huh? She says, well, because of the uniqueness of this, I have to submit this to review. And I, what review? And she told me that this, anything unusual has to be reviewed by a committee. So I waited a whole year. Finally, I get a letter saying I'm denied. And I'm denied because of the fact that at the time of my marriage, I was not legally a woman. Those were the words that were in the denial. And so I was shocked. I was shamed. That is so insulting. It was just devastating. And Lambda sent in the appeal. I am certainly wanting to bring this forth because to make this transition is not easy. A lot of young people have lost their families, lost their support. And my suggestion to them was to do what I did. Don't do anything. Rely on the basis of the fact that they loved you once, and it will start shining through again. Several people that I knew that changed their sex committed suicide. Just simply horrible because they didn't have anyone look at them and say, I understand, and I still want you to live. I hope that Lambda succeeds in this case, not for the money, but for the act of humanity that is absolutely necessary here.
Well, this is maybe my 6th or 7th time watching this documentary, and I still have close to crying feelings.
I think you're not alone here. Like I got teary-eyed for sure, and I saw some people saying in the chat, "Oh yeah, is anybody else close to crying?" And Rehab just said, "I'm crying," and it certainly is a very moving story.
It is a very moving story, and that's the power of stories and storytelling. When it is sincere, when it is, when we get vulnerable and share our stories, there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and there's a lot that we can change our stereotypes in our brain, and we can become aware of what we understand of this world. I don't know, Ingo, if you want to go to breakout
Yeah.
sessions, or is it easier to share here? Whatever you decide, we can do that.
So let's do that. I know that some of you really enjoy breakouts.
Which it all boils down into our beliefs, right? And what we are understanding about each other, from each other. I've seen several other really moving documentaries or reports or stories about the situation with immigrants, and after the news and media reports about caravans and the panic around immigrants, the reactions that people had to immigrant community was really sad and unfortunate. But then stories of people getting to know each other, getting to know an immigrant family, even someone who was not a supporter of the policies of this administration, who was a supporter of the policies of this administration. I watched a documentary about a man, I think in West Virginia, who accepted a tenant in his apartment who was an immigrant family, refugee family. And then he got to know that family and he became friends with them. And he loved them, and he started caring for the children of that family and saw how hardworking they are. And that changed his mindset. So even the change in policies and, discriminatory policies and rules could start from us recognizing what is the reality, or what is the perception that we have about the other person, which I'm hoping that's what we're seeing to change for this November.
And Nassim, I think the movie is a beautiful example of that, because I myself, like when I started, I love that it started with the images of the airplane, and I could very much relate to that. It was very relatable as a feeling and as an experience, and hearing the voice, right? And I realized that because of the voice, because of the story, because of Second World War and Pilot, I made up the story about this person. And then when she started sharing about her journey, it took me a while to actually to comprehend or to bring that together in my mind. And I was thinking like this, like it's so weird being exposed to that, because as we discussed before, as I would say, like I'm not biased, yet I am like seeing something like this because I recognize how my like implicit bias affects my perception and my kind of modeling of that person that I never saw before.
Right. No, thanks for sharing that. That's a very great point. Well, there are explicit biases and implicit biases, right? And unfortunately, some of them that are connected to bigger reasons with explicit biases are more difficult to overcome, and more difficult to change. But even with them, the only way that I personally see through, and I've talked with many other like people in the field and read a lot about it, because of the same, I come from the same background in the Middle East, from Iran, and had like a personal story of a family member who came out of closet, and I saw the reactions to that. And that's why I was like really searching for that specific story that you were sharing. Most of the time, at the end of the day, when stories are shared, when we see each other as people, as human beings, and find out that love is love, and all that could help. I don't know. Honestly, I would love to ask this question from other participants. There's a lot of amazing feedback here. Yeah.
And I feel like we could have a conversation for an hour longer on this topic, but I'm also well aware of the time, sadly enough. And Rick just sent me a private message saying like, hey, how about hanging out 30 minutes longer? Maybe not today, but maybe another time. So I really much appreciate that comment. And I'm certainly open to do that in the future, to have like a little bit of a continuous conversation, because I hope you out there, as well as Nassim and myself, I think we all like feel like this conversation is important. That's why we show up today. We are here because we recognize we have some sort of bias. And when it comes to becoming, the first step is self-awareness. So this is not only as I think this is not only about the other, as today's session I think showed. It's also very much about ourselves. And Nassim, I want to thank you for really like making that clear to me, and driving home a couple of important points about our biases, how they are not racism, and how we have an opportunity, and possibly also like a little bit of a homework to do in terms of identifying, confronting, and working with our biases, because at the end of the day, we all make up the society that we live in.
Yep.
With that, Nassim, thank you so much for joining us here today and for sharing your insights and thoughts. And also to everybody else here who came and spent this hour with us. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope to see you again soon.